A Second Opinion, Hocus Pocus Fanfiction. Almost exactly a year later, Catherine inevitably found herself drawn back to his grave. Sometimes she would simply camp out in the area with a book and thermos of tea, and others she found herself seated atop his reburied casket, scouring tomes of old necromancy texts. Not that she had any real intention of doing anything, but she had become insanely curious about what raising the dead really entailed. She tried asking around at Omen, but Allison, the shop owner, had shooed her out. She'd insisted the young witch didn't want to mess around with that stuff. Trust her, she'd said. It made Kate wonder if perhaps Allison knew something about the magic of the Sandersons and simply wouldn't talk about it. Did she know Billy? It never really occurred to her to ask before, but now. Well, there was always time in the morning. On this Samhain night, Catherine had decided to stake out the old burial hill in case anything strange happened or anyone felt the need to rise. Again. Barring all that, which was unlikely anyways, or so she told herself, there had been some vandalism happening in other parts of the cemetery. A group of teens had taken it upon themselves to claim a section of headstones on top of the hill for drug use and promiscuous sex. Catherine had no doubt they'd likely be trouble tonight if she came across them. Not that she was without her wiles, of course. But it came as no surprise to her that she felt responsible for the safety of William Butcherson's resting place. It was her fault that a small article had run in the local paper about grave robbers and such last year. That wasn't even close to the gist of it, but she didn't want there to be more trouble. As fate would have it, the sun set and trouble found her. Shortly after darkness had settled over the town of Salem, Catherine heard the wild hooting and cackling of a few youths as they approached the older graves. One of them held a flashlight in one hand and a beer can in the other. The second boy was holding a baseball bat. Seriously? She huffed to herself. They think they're going to wreck tombstones tonight? That's not the brightest thing to do. Rising to a low crouch and pulling her black hoodie up over her red curls, she backed slowly down towards a tree and edged behind it as the boys came into view. So who do you want to mess up first? One of them asked. The other laughed. Let's burn some witches. There aren't any witches buried here, dumbass. Oh dear, if they only knew. As the two boys started eyeing up headstones and reading off the epithets, Catherine wondered if she should get involved or try to scare them off. But wouldn't it be grand if Billy the Butcher burst up from the ground suddenly and had them pissing themselves? The story might spread, and the place might finally be a resting ground again. Still, she felt guilty about last year's debacle, and so she hesitated in place, keeping her eyes glued to the hooligans chortling over some 18th century spelling. Shifting a bit in place, her foot came up against something sharp and hard. Looking down, she was pleased to find a couple of rocks small enough to hold in one hand. At the risk of causing these idiots brain damage, she hefted one in her palm and tossed it. It landed just to the left of Beer Can's foot, and the guy whipped around with a yelp. The heck was that? Quit screaming. What's your problem? Something almost hit me. It came out of the woods. Batter sneered at his friend. It was probably a bird, you pansy. When the second stone collided with his leg, he jerked around, eyes wild. I told you, man, Beer Can whined. Something's here with us. Catherine grinned in the darkness. Good, she thought. They're spooked. Maybe they'll leave now. Instead, the batter puffed up his chest in a show of bravado and shouted into the woods. I know you're there, a-hole. Quit messing with us and come out, or I'm going to take this bat to your skull. Feeling around for another stone, a twig snapped beneath her foot and she froze. From over there! And suddenly footsteps began approaching. Oh shit, she grimaced. Don't let them find me. And then she felt it. That familiar upheaval of earth, sifting soil and cracking wood. The boys must have felt it too, because they'd stopped just shy of trampling on Billy's coffin. Now they both stood, faces white, gazing around frantically. Catherine would look back on that night and wish she had her camera. Billy lifted the lid of his casket and sat up before stretching out his arms. He caught sight of the duo and glanced up. That's really all it took, and they were both screaming like children and fleeing in terror. The beer can was abandoned, and the baseball bat could be heard clicking against tree trunks all the way back down to the road. The young witch stood and meandered over to her reanimated friend. "So we meet again, William Butcherson." With a jerk, the zombie gazed up at her, recognition immediately painting his features, and he gladly accepted the hand she'd offered down to him. She looked less witchy to him this time. Gone were the long black skirts and dark makeup. Tonight, she wore a simple pair of jeans, boots, and a dark jacket with a hood, which had been pulled up over her loose curls. Impulsively, he reached over and tugged it down, freeing her hair. "That's better." Catherine grinned. "Yeah, this was my half-assed attempt at a Dark Templar costume. Probably a complete failure, since I'm sure denim is blacklisted in their dress code." They sat side by side again, on that same bench as last year. Only this time the night was young and full of potential. She'd filled him in on the teen revelers he'd unwittingly frightened, and he asked about Danny again. "I guess Lacey's been talking to her a lot lately. She's coming back to Salem for the winter holidays. If I get a chance to meet her, I'll tell her to stop by," Catherine offered. "I'm sure the look on her face will be priceless." "Think she'd remember me?" She thunked him on the shoulder. "Dude, you're pretty unforgettable. Those kids will probably have your filthy, poofy hair etched into their memories until kingdom come." "Speaking of memories." "What is it?" His head tilted and he fixed her with those brilliant blue eyes. "Does the name Allison ring any bells for you?" He perked up almost immediately. "Oh yeah, 'twas Max's lady friend. A beauty, too. Of course, she couldn't hold a candle to you." The last bit was added rather hastily, as if in fear of offending her. Then he began to fidget. If zombies could blush, he might be blushing right about now. "She's still lovely," Catherine assured with a sly grin. "And unattached, I hear. Perhaps I could offer my newly discovered matchmaking skills and reintroduce you." Billy could only blink stupidly at this girl for a moment before it clicked. "Ah, you're joking. Nearly frightened me back to death, you did." "I suppose I was only half joking." He shook his head slowly. "No, she's a lovely lass, and clever. Not my type, you might say." The witch chuckled. "Yeah, we're not even going to get into your type, sir. Feel up for a stroll around town?" She stood, flexing her ankles to loosen them up, and gazed expectantly down at him, before he too stood. "I would be delighted." He offered her his arm and felt a genuine smile creep over his mouth as she accepted, and they began their trek towards the heart of Salem.